Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on how to lead in a time of crisis. Can I just check that everyone can hear me okay? Brilliant. Okay, so my name is Nadim Choudhury, and I head up the Careers and Employability Department. I'm a lecturer on our undergraduate programs at the London Institute of Banking and Finance. I'm joined by my colleague today, Heather Tilston, who's our Head of Media and PR. Thank you so much for all of you who have given up their lunchtime to join us today. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to download afterwards. Just as a curiosity, can I just ask where everyone is logging in from today, please? Kent, home. Malta, Leicester, Malta. We have a few international colleagues, the Peak District, Poland, Paraguay, fantastic. As you can see, a lot of people from all parts of the world, not just the UK and Europe, but we've got international people online today. So hopefully this will be an interesting session. If you've got any sound issues, please check your speaker volume. It also helps to log in and out and back again if you still can't hear us. You seem to be having some kind of technical issue with the screen. Just 1 second. Fantastic. We'll make a start. Okay, so a few disclaimers, if I may, before I start. I don't consider myself as an expert in the field of crisis management, nor am I an academic researcher in the field of leadership studies. But what I do have is over 17 years experience of coaching leaders within banking and finance. And I've got a background in economics, and I've trained in organization psychology, and I've got first-hand experience of managing teams, large teams, during two specific crises. First, during the 7/7 bombings, and the other during the crash of 2009, specifically dealing with the fallout or layoff of Lehman Brothers employees. I was managing the alumni careers function at London Business School at the time, and I supported dozens of MBA and alumni students who lost their jobs. Therefore, I'd like to think I can share some of my observations, but I'm sure there are others on the call today who have equal amounts, if not more experience, and I'd really be glad to if you would share your experiences with us today as well. I encourage you to challenge what I say today, and I welcome disagreement. In fact, I encourage it, as it will hopefully help us learn and offer a different perspective. I don't have all the answers. That's what I'm trying to say. So webinars are a great way to reach a large audience, but it can be sometimes difficult to encourage engagement. So I therefore ask you to ask questions, make comments during the session and afterwards, and both Heather and I will try and answer your questions at the end. Okay, so before we look at what we're going to cover today, can I just have a quick poll just to see who's on the call? How many people manage one or plus people in their organizations or businesses? Okay, a significant amount of people. The next poll. How many people manage, say, 10 or more? %, 70%, 80%, okay. And next question, do you work or have you worked in the banking and financial services sector? Brilliant. Okay. And final one before we start is, do you have experience of managing teams through a crisis? Right, that's really nice to see. I think I'm talking with fellow professionals from the sector. We've got some senior managers in the room. We've got some leaders in the room, and we've got enough people who've sort of managed a crisis. So hopefully the discussions will be really interesting today. Okay, so in the outline, what are we going to cover today? I'm going to set the scene and provide you with some of my observations and insights into what companies and leaders should be doing during a time of crisis. particularly looking at the impact on our banking sector and governments in general. We'll also provide some insights into what behaviours leaders can utilise in a time of crisis. I'm going to take a look at the pre-mortem management technique and how this can be used when dealing with crisis or risk management. And then my colleague Heather Tilston will be leading our discussions on communicating during a crisis. And finally, if we have time, we'll look at some of the strategies to manage your own mental health. But this may require another webinar in itself because it's such an important and huge topic. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that none of us could have imagined the realities of what we are facing today. The coronavirus pandemic has placed extraordinary demand on all leaders within our sector and beyond. Not only does this virus take life, it also has a unique capacity to create anxiety for all of us and real fear. If you're a leader in your company during this time, or you run a department, how can you plan to alleviate this fear and anxiety amongst your staff? We're just at the start of the crisis here in the UK, and many organisations, large and small, are frantically trying to work out in how they can create sense and meaning for their employees and customers. This has meant that leaders are having to really dig deep and come outside of their comfort zone, and are having to deal with the sheer complexities of managing large teams remotely. Some commentators have suggested that this crisis has all the landmarks of it being a landscape crisis. Now, a landscape crisis refers to a crisis which has a sort of a unexpected degree of uncertainty. It has a sequence of events. It's enormous in its scale, and it's overwhelming in its speed. And there's loads of uncertainty. And the most scariest thing about this is it creates a sense of disorientation, a feeling of loss of control, and a strong emotional disturbance. So I'd like to pick up on this theme, if I may. How many of you are feeling a loss of control and emotional responses to what is going on? Please type your comments into the box and I'll read out some of them. Partially, not really. Lucky to have a business that planned ahead. Okay, so we've got mixed responses. I, for one, personally, and I'm happy to say this, find it really jarring on what's going on. In normal times, many of us suffer from mental health issues, but I think now it's become much more magnified. For those of us who like to think of ourselves as being resilient, we are now finding that the new realities of isolation can be immensely difficult, and leaders in all organizations are taking the issue of well-being really seriously. I'm sure all of you received emails from your HR teams about how to manage mental health. If not, you will be. So before I move on to provide some of my key tips on how to manage during a time of crisis, I wanted to share some of my reflections on the impact that this is likely to have on the banking sector. Looking at the attendees who are in the room today, I think this might be welcomed. So these reflections are based on my reading and research over the last 2 weeks. So please feel free to challenge me if you think I've missed something, or share in the chat box if you think there are other ways that the virus will impact our sector. So before we go into the banking sector, overall, I've seen a few themes emerging which are already in motion. There's going to be a faster shift, definitely, to a cashless economy and a paperless business. I mean, this was happening beforehand, but in the last 2 weeks, it's really expanded. We're also seeing that retailers are collapsing. And again, this was happening beforehand, but now retailers are going to be urged to move their business away from shops to online. If you remember, all of this was happening before, but it's definitely going to be exacerbated by the crisis. So let's take a look at the banking sector in general. I think with this sudden and sharp contraction of the economic activity which is taking place, many individuals and businesses will first and foremost struggle to make loan repayments on banks on time. Like all classes of assets held by banks are losing value, this will naturally lead to a deterioration of asset quality on the bank's main balance sheets. even in spite of all the tax holidays that are likely to happen. Also, the effects on the banks will vary depending on countries and institutions. Some variables will include how a bank's affected country is hit by the virus, not just in terms of health, but also economically, and the bank's basic strength in how it deals with measures such as its NPL ratio, the non-performing loans ratio, as well as their capital adequacy ratio. But I think the real danger here is that some of the smaller banks, mainly in higher rated countries, may struggle as governments are likely to direct those support mechanisms to larger institutions. Although I don't think we're at that stage just yet. The problems we likely are to face will be concentrated around those countries whose banking systems are already weak. So let's think about this. You've got large economies such as India, Vietnam, even Italy, Bangladesh, Kazakhstan, large economies, but their banking systems are weak. The other area that I think will be impacted is around sovereign payment, and we'll probably see this in the next year or so. So as in most crises, those countries that suffer the most will be the ones who are the most fragile. I think the IMF have said that they are likely to support countries who are coming under the effect of this crisis. And they were saying anywhere between sort of 10 billion and 40 billion US dollars that they'll be happy to provide. I don't think that's going to be much help, to be honest. So as you can see, the impact of the virus is quite multifaceted on the banking and global economy. Anyway, so those are my reflections. Is there anything else that you think I'm missing? Okay. Right, let's move on. Now, it's really important to look at some of the behaviors that leaders can take during this crisis. So nearly all of us on this call are leaders, and you're a leader in your company. Whether you manage a small team or a large function, it really doesn't matter. I think the fundamental thing you need to do during this crisis is acknowledge that this is indeed a crisis. Recognition is incredibly important. Please don't be like Mike Ashley, the CEO of Sports Direct, who thought that everything was fine until 2 days ago. Although this is like, what he did was most likely to be sort of like a PR or a marketing stunt. Anyway, I digress. Recognizing that this is a real crisis is a really important step and a difficult step for leaders to do. If we take a look at a similar crisis to this, it would probably be the SARS outbreak, which happened in 2002. Not many companies foresaw the economic impact of that. I think commentators were saying at the time that it would have between 30 billion to 100 billion US dollars in terms of its impact. So given this toll, it's incredibly important not to underestimate the impact that this is likely to have on your business. So once a leader recognizes a crisis, what do they need to do next? So in a pandemic such as this, it requires a response which cannot actually be pre-engineered or planned. So when I look back at my own experience and how I dealt with a specific crisis, back in I think it was 2005, 7, I was working for a company, an American university. We had some really clear policies on how to deal with the situation. But looking back on it, what really worked for us at the time was to have a specific mindset around behaviors that we enacted within our company. So I'll tell you the story. I was heading up an American university at the time. We had about 200 undergraduate American students on campus. They're all about to start their internships in banking and finance. For many, this was the first day of their work. So I got into work that morning somehow, knowing that we had to account for all 200 of our students. So we got into a leadership group of 3 of us who were managing this crisis at the time. We had to account for all of our students. We had to have the comms ready. We had to deal with the psychological safety of our staff. Mobile phones weren't working. I'm sure some of you can remember this day quite well. So we got into groups. We set ourselves objectives. We worked all the way through our actions. I'm not going to go through all of the actions now, but we accounted for all 200 of those students just in time for their parents to wake up in the States to ensure that we send the right messages out to them. So this is just my own experience, and I'm sure others on the call will have their own. So what I think leaders really need to do in a time of crisis is not to have a predefined response plan, but focus on behaviors and mindsets that will prevent them from overcoming some of these issues. So let's look at these behaviors in a bit more detail next. So during a crisis, the natural instinct of a leader in an organization is to lead with a top-down response, thinking that by showing strength, it's going to be the only way forward. This is so far from the truth. I think in this time, leaders really need to relinquish this firmly held belief that a structured top-down response is going to work. Leaders really need to mobilize their organizations by setting clear priorities for the response and empowering people to come up with the solutions. So what do I mean by this? Leaders need to create a network or networks for a response to take place. So a network of team consists of highly adaptable assembly groups, which are united by a common purpose. So the best example of this I can think of right now is what's going on right now in the UK with the COVID-19 mutual aid groups. I think as of this morning, over 500,000 people have signed up to support government activities. Now, they're not a part of the government, but they're a part of a wider network which is being led by the government. And I've just recently joined my local Islington group. It's amazing how quickly these networks have mobilized. So in many cases, the networks of teams will include an integrated nerve center. So these are your basic functions. So you've got people who sort of protect the workforce, people who protect the supply chain, you've got comms people who look after the customer engagement, and then obviously one of the most important functions is finance. A lot of financial stress testing which is taking place now. So regardless of the functional scope, I think that for networks to be really effective, they need to display a few essential qualities. You need to be able to capture information really quickly, and you need to come up with solutions. It's absolutely fine if you don't know if it's the right thing to do, but you should go with your intuition, but also make sure you capture as much information as possible. And one of the most important qualities is around collaboration and transparency. So quick question to people who are on the team, on the call today. In this current situation, how many would say that their organization is being transparent in how they're dealing with the crisis? Great, yes, not at all, yes, very transparent. Okay, well that's really nice to hear. Okay, so it sounds like the leadership in your organizations are really taking this seriously. So another crucial part of the leader's role, especially in this time, is to deal with the emotional issues that come up in the stressor environment, and you need to be empathetic. Now, leaders are obviously going to be empathetic at this time, but you as leaders also need to be open to the empathy as well, because the natural instinct of your teams is to want to be able to help you, and you need to allow them to be able to help you. Okay, so a lot of what I've just described comes from a fantastic model created by McKinsey, which clearly illustrates this. Can everyone spend about 30 seconds looking at this model and ask yourself, to what extent is your company or organization implementing some of these networks, and to what effect? So as you can see, you've got the executive team on the top, then you've got the response leadership team, and then you've got the action teams. Now, when I look at this, I can actually see that a lot of things that we're doing in LIBF, a lot of our teams fall into this network model. So the next question is, Liam, can I get the poll up? What are your thoughts on this model? Outreach is good. God bless teams. Great. Good. Similar to what we've got set up. That's fantastic. Good concept. Good, appropriate for larger organizations. Okay. It would be interesting to see if we can do this for smaller organizations. Good. Effective. True, but needs more about informal links too. Okay. So there's a disagreement between, is it going to be effective for large or small organizations? Liam, the next question, please. Okay. So are your organizations using these networks to respond to the current crisis? So taking a look at some of these networks that you've got here. Yeah, okay. I think so. Fine. Unfortunately, no. Okay. Similar. Okay. And the next question. Any criticisms of this model? So we've already had one. The is it applicable to smaller organizations? No. Okay. Great. Okay, so we've answered those questions. I'm now going to move on and talking about the importance of decision making. So decision making really must be moved away from being top down. And this really involves gathering and granting others the authority to make and implement those decisions without having to gain approval. This is really difficult for leaders who like control. I think one of the most important functions of leaders is to quickly establish this decision-making architecture in their organizations and actually have accountability. So people are empowered to make those decisions, especially during a time of crisis. It's highly unlikely that during this time of uncertainty, many decision makers are likely to make mistakes, especially within those networks. The one that comes up to mind, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, is our IT teams. You need to be able to forgive them, but they also need to be able to learn to manage the situations, especially when people are overreacting. Many colleagues are capable of taking out their frustrations on the IT teams, and I'm sure all of our IT teams at the moment in our respective organizations are working night and day to ensure that our operations are stable. So as the crisis evolves, you'll also find that new leaders emerge. So when you take away the decision-making processes from being top-down, you allow other people in your organizations to make decisions, new leaders emerge. Now, the best example I can give of this is during the crash of 2009, I was managing the alumni careers function at London Business School. I had 6 of my MBA students start at the bank at Lehman Brothers. And when the bank crashed, they lost their jobs. We had 25 alumni who were reaching out to us, all needed support. We soon realized that instead of providing them with individual support, it was easier for us to introduce them to our alumni network. And many of our alumni became leaders in helping their fellow peers find new employment, although not everyone was lucky. So what we realized there was we couldn't do this on our own. We had to reach out to a group of volunteers who emerged as leaders in our organizations. So think about that. Think about, say, department heads or key people in your organizations who might have a skill such as project management or a technology skill that they can utilize in a time of crisis. The other thing that's going to be really important is that leaders practice something called deliberate calm. So this is a psychological trait that you, in the face of adversity and psychological stress that people are facing, the role of a leader is to maintain calm. Even if inside you're feeling anxious and nervous, it's really important that you stay calm, especially when difficult decisions are needed to be made. And I think there's a real balance that leaders need to show between being overly confident and then actually showing realism as well. So you'll see a lot of leaders now who are being incredibly positive, but if we're all really honest, most people are worried about losing their jobs. So you'd be amazed how many people want to know about the financials of the company. So it's so important that you need to stay transparent. Okay, so the final one is about communicating effectively. I'm not going to talk a bit about this. I'm going to let Heather talk about this when I finish my section, but obviously we'll talk about the importance of communicating effectively. Okay, so let's pause for a moment, and we've talked about some of the behaviors and traits that you need to effectively lead during a time of crisis. I'm now going to talk about a management technique which I found really useful, and this is about managing risk, and it's a process called the pre-mortem management technique. How many people have heard of this technique before? Great, okay, we've got a few people. Okay, so you can start to use this immediately in your respective organizations, especially when you're trying to manage risks. This is not the same as managing a crisis. I just want to say this first. It will help you think about and take concrete steps in how you can mitigate, say, the future failure of a project. To stress, this technique is different from crisis management. It's much more a general and a practical tool that you can use. So this was created by a lady called Deborah Mitchell from the Wharton Business School. And she did some research in the late 80s. And what she found was that with prospective hindsight, so it's basically saying sort of imagining that an event has already occurred, it actually increases the ability to correctly identify the reasons of its future outcomes by 30%. So this is all about visualization. Okay, so I'd like everyone on the call to think about a project that they've maybe worked on in the past or they are currently working on. Maybe you're a key stakeholder or you've had to lead this project. Just imagine that for a second. Okay, I can imagine you all closing your eyes and thinking of this project. So imagine all the reasons your project could turn into a miserable failure. So then figure out how you can prevent those from ever happening while there's still time. So you need to visualize the risks and opportunities for the project and then figure out how to navigate yourself away from or towards them. You need about 6 or 10 people involved in this activity, and they should be the key stakeholders in your organization. Usually about 90 minutes. Make sure you're in a room, you're not going to be disturbed. You use all those paraphernalia such as flip charts, sticky notes, etc., timers. For one half of the brain, if you're the facilitator, you need to make sure that it's half empty. So I'm asking you to think of your inner critic, the cynics, and make sure you've woken up on the wrong side of the bed. It's all doom and gloom. And the other side of your brain, as a facilitator, you should have your rose-tinted spectacles on. You should have eternal optimism. Imagine that it's a joyous and a bright sunny day. A bit like today. I'm in North London at the moment and stuck indoors like nearly everyone, I'm sure, in this call. And the sun is shining, lovely, bright outside. So imagine it's a beautiful day like today. And then what you need to do is follow these steps. So this is the pre-mortem exercise. Step 1, you need to introduce this exercise and the impending doom that may happen, and then you need to find the opportunities and the successes so that everyone is on the same page. It's really important to let your imagination run here so that people feel validated, that they can express their opinions. What usually happens is when you're doing a project and if you're a charismatic leader, no one wants to rock the boat and people aren't willing to say what they really think. So you need to give them the space to do that. Step 2 is you need to divide the group into 2 groups. So you've got the failure team and then you've got the success team. So in the failure team, you should be brainstorming all the reasons your project could fail. So what were the warning signs, any decisions that didn't take place, any assumptions that need to be proved false. You need to write down each of these outcomes on a sticky note and then in turn on a whiteboard. And similarly, the success team should do the same. Brainstorm all the ways that you think the project was a huge success. Did you exceed your goals? Did you succeed in ways that you didn't expect to? So once everyone has created this vision of success and failure, it's time to cross-examine. And this is where you really have to ask those difficult questions, which are thought-provoking as well. So things such as, what caused that to happen? Why didn't we see that coming? Any last-minute additions? This is the time to really sort of refine. Step 4, so now that you've found key successes and key failures, everyone in the room who are the key stakeholders, you have a vote. You have 3 votes, and they can use them as they please. You may vote on many ideas, but all 3 votes need to lead to some kind of major risk. So when voting, consider the likelihood of each outcome, whether a positive or a negative, and then focus on outcomes that you can actually influence. and that everyone agrees that that should be the focus. And then step 5, you need to make a plan, how you're going to do this. And finally, accountability. So you need to assign people who will be responsible for managing those key risks that have been identified. There have been some people on the team who've, on the call, who've said they've done this before or are aware of it. Can anyone give me an example of where they've done this? Agile sprint reviews. Okay. Yes, it's something similar. Yeah. You see this in innovation programs as well. Similar things are done. Great. Okay. Some people are saying it works well. I've done this in various times when I've launched departments in HE before, or when I've launched big projects. I've got the key stakeholders in a room and we've gone through this process. It's it kind of sounds quite simplistic, but if everyone commits to it, it can actually really bring out some things that you may not be aware of. Okay, so that brings the end to my session. Bang on time, half an hour. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Heather Tilston, who's the head of media and PR, and Heather will be talking about the importance of the strategies that you can do to communicate.
Hello everyone, I hope everyone's all feeling well, and thanks Nadim for that really interesting talk. I mean, obviously the more you can do in terms of ahead of a project or a scenario happening, the better to work out what could go wrong. And we don't often have that luxury in a crisis. A bit about me, I've been in the front line of managing comms around crisis. In my time, I was head of comms at the UK's Fund of Last Resort for the finance sector, which was the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, during collapses of major financial institutions, with consumers facing potentially immediate and severe detriment, and the scheme had to be seen to quickly ride to the rescue, not just to save individuals, but also to bolster the UK financial services system. I've also worked for other organisations and dealt with other crises, and currently, of course, anyone in comms at the moment is going to be looking at what's been going on in the current scenario, and I hope you're all keeping well. So before we go into talking about crisis communications, it's worth thinking about where the crises come from. They're very hard to predict. Obviously, they can come from world events, natural disasters, as we've seen, but also from customer complaints or criminal acts or wrongdoing. And organisations are often alerted through, if it's not a government announcement, there might be a question from customer services, or there'd be a tweet on social media. And in my case, quite often it's come directly through a press inquiry. And quite often they're quite local to the organisation, so we're in a very unusual situation at the moment, but they often are quite local to an organisation or a sector. So how do they make us feel? I've put a few words down here. I don't know how you guys feel about the current situation, but how do you feel when we're faced with a scenario we don't understand or uncertain? What's your response? Anxiety, yeah, quite scared, frustrated, absolutely, yeah. Hopeful, that's a good one. Great, yeah, well, everyone's very unsure and curious. I think the point is that we are emotional beings, and crises are emotional, and we have to respond when we're thinking about communications as human beings. All too often, organisations want to hide behind jargon and technical language and legalese, but actually that's at the very point when customers and our staff need us to show that we are human beings, and that yes, we understand that a crisis does cause an emotional reaction. So when we think about communicating in a crisis, what can it help us do? So it can help us quickly, if you have a plan in place, as lots of business continuity plans will have in place a broad skeleton of who their stakeholders are, scenarios they might have to deal with, who they need to communicate, what kind of things they might be worried about, and the kinds of resources we're going to need, such as fact sheets or frequently asked questions. Maybe we want to do some videos, some social media. So it helps you quickly identify your stakeholders, the kinds of messages you're going to need to think about, the resources and how to get those delivered, what channels we might need to use, and the time frame. Usually the time frame is pretty quick. So preparation can go a long way when you're in the thick of it, as they say. And there are some key elements behind what's involved in having a good comms plan. So a stakeholder map, some scenario plans. I'm going to give you some examples of these in a minute. You might have some example. Oh, something's happened. You might have some example statements. Something's happened to our slides, but we'll hopefully get them back. You might have some example statements and content that you can then use as your basis for your messaging. What's also important is to think about internally who your key actors are, and who might deputise for them if they're not available. Quite often we'll have our list of the important people that we might rely on in a crisis, but actually what happens if they're not well or if they're not there. And also a list of general tools that you might need to call on really quickly. So I'll go through some of the examples of these. So one of the things that's worth thinking about ahead of time, preferably, is your stakeholder map. So who do you need to think about? Who do you need to communicate? What will each of those audiences need? And what channels will you use? So this example here is a very basic summary and for LIBF. And within each of these boxes, there are obviously multiple groups. We're a global organisation. Our students range from undergraduates in our campus at Lovett Lane, professionals studying trade finance in, say, Singapore or India, studying banking in Abu Dhabi. We also have around 50,000 school children taking our exams every year in UK schools, and professionals studying for regulated qualifications around the UK, including financial advice and mortgage advice. So in that one box, there's a lot of different stakeholders that are going to need lots of different, have lots of different questions, have lots of different information that they need. But as a starting point, if you have your buckets of stakeholders that you are contributing, that you need to talk to, that's a really good way to get you going. Also, as a global organisation, we have to take into account time differences, culture, but this is one way to get you started, and there's a lot to think about, so it's worth doing as much of this as you can ahead of time. I've lost the chat box, I'm afraid, in terms of seeing your comments. I'm hoping they'll come back, so I'm sorry if I'm sounding a bit hesitant. Oh, there we go. I'm seeing if, oh no, it's disappeared again. No, it's come back. Brilliant. Okay, I can see you again. If you've got any thoughts on any of these slides as I go through them, please. Hello, nice to see you all. Please do continue. So the other thing to think about is lots of organisations will do some scenario planning. And when you're in a crisis, there's nothing worse than a blank piece of paper. So again, as part of business continuity plans, many organisations will do this. For example, they may say, okay, let's imagine we've got loss of access to our building for, say, 2 hours, 2 days, 2 weeks. Who will we need to communicate with? First and foremost, it will probably be staff, and then people that might be coming to the building for a meeting or an event. Will the IT be available? Can people work from home? So lots of organisations will start thinking about this in terms of different scenarios. That's a really good way to get you going, to think about here's what we'd need to say to different audiences under these circumstances. As the coronavirus started to develop in the UK, we started working on messages that we would need for different audiences. Of course, as soon as the events unfolded, we needed to change and update our information pretty immediately. But again, at least we started from a place where we had something to work with rather than just a blank piece of paper. One word of warning on scenario planning, though, you could go on forever. So there are some main ones that I think most organisations would plan for, which is loss of access to building, loss of access to their services, breakdown in business operations. So some broad categories. Don't go mad on this because you could spend a lot of time looking at this on its own. And then just a word on how, just a word on the cycle of comms as you go through situation. I don't know how you guys are feeling about the current situation, but whenever a crisis hits an organisation, the first thing usually that happens is we want to get the facts. What's going on? What do we need to know? And then we can plan for how we communicate that to our different audiences. So we think about who we need to talk to, by when, what the messages are, get all of those ducks in a row, get all of our resources prepared for the website by video, social media, etc. And then issue. You would issue your comms. And then, of course, you want to see how the comms are landing. So do you need to follow up? Have things changed? How are people reacting? Is the messaging clear? And then, of course, you keep your communications under review. It's quite often too easy in a crisis to do the immediate communications and then think, right, we're done. And then without thinking, actually, we need to keep an eye on what's going on and make sure that our websites and our information is up to date as we go through. And usually as well, there comes a natural break in dealing with a crisis, that where you can think about, you can take a step back and say, okay, what have we learnt? Here's what we've done. What have we learnt from this? What would we do? What would it do differently next time? And yes, I think Nicola's just commented that it's really hard to get the comms right when facts are changing so quickly. That is correct, but there are things they can do to stress test what they're going to say to see how they might land. I think, we mentioned earlier in the presentation the use of the phrase social distancing versus stay at home and what's clearer. I think it's very difficult for governments in fast changing situations to get the wording and the messaging right 100% first time. But I think introducing a phrase that people are not familiar with in a crisis is probably not something I would recommend. It's jargon at the end of the day, and we need to avoid that. So I can talk a little bit about how this looks in action. So I mentioned I work for Nest, the National Employment Savings Trust. So Nest was set up by government as a pension scheme that any employer could use to automatically enrol their workers when they introduced automatic enrolment into the UK in 2012. It was set up as a government intervention in a private market and was under intense scrutiny from the word go. But anyway, Nest was doing okay. Automatic enrolment became law in 2012. And to get a head start, Nest launched early and started taking member contributions in 2011. So picture the scene, Nest is up and running. Some employers have got on board, and we're just starting to settle into the pension landscape, and private providers are seeing how Nest will work. Next thing we know, the corporation, so the organisation who ran the scheme, not the actual scheme, was hit by a significant fraud. So that was never going to be good news, and it stood a very, very good chance of undermining Nest before it even got going. So what did we do about it? Well, the CEO at the time, Tim Jones, was very quick off his feet as well. He pulled together a project group to look at what was happening, what had happened to us, so the fact-gathering stage, how we could fix it and how we could communicate about it. That was the planning stage in the cycle. I was in the group from day one, and I think it's really important for comms people to be included as early as possible. We're very good at honing messaging and wording, but also thinking about coming back to the emotion, how messages might be received and the emotional response. We had to inform the government and regulator ahead of anything going out more broadly, which we did. But we're also really clear from the start that we were going to own this. We were going to announce it ourselves. It wasn't going to leak and come out as news and try and hide it in any way. So we spent a lot of time going through, here's what we're going to say, We're going to explain as much as we possibly can to be open and transparent. Make sure that all of our stakeholders will be included in the messaging, so all the employers we were dealing with and our members, to reassure them that they weren't affected. It wasn't anything to do with members' money. And then we made a plan to announce it. I don't know about you guys, about companies that have gone through crisis. There's nothing worse than watching a company who have made a mistake refuse to say sorry. So we were really clear from the off that we would accept this was a mistake. It was a failing of ours that had allowed this fraud to happen, and we were doing everything we can to fix that. So we gave as much detail as we could without giving anything away to fraudsters. We said what had happened, how we'd fixed it, what we were going to do next to prevent it, and made sure that people were clear our members were not affected. And we communicated really quickly with all of our stakeholders, and the messaging across all of our channels was consistent. So it hit the newspapers, it got in the FT and the Daily Mail and a few of the trade press, but then that was it. So it didn't run for weeks. We actually had to do very little follow-up and review, and the lessons learned from that was we would have done the same if something else had happened. So own up, be very clear about what's happened and how you're going to fix it, and then sort of make sure that it's clear how your different stakeholders are affected. And Nest today has over 10 million members and over 10 billion assets under management, so it's doing okay. So that didn't go too badly for them, even though it was a disaster at the time. That's what it felt like initially. So principles then of good communications through a crisis. I'm going to come to these in a minute, but I wanted to ask you a question. So I've had coronavirus email after email from companies telling me how much they care about me as a customer, how much they care about their staff and what they're doing. How about you? Have you had lots of them? Yeah, too many, far too many. Carla's fed up with them, so many. You like them? Oh, well done, Joe. In my experience, I don't know about you, but they're very long emails. And 9 times out of 10, the point of the email is at the bottom of a very long chunk of text. It's easy to miss it. It may be telling me that my service is changing, or the product is changing, or my delivery is going to take 2 weeks. That's the kind of thing, as a customer, I want to know. I want to know upfront. I don't want to have to read right to the bottom of a very long email, and most customers actually won't read right to the bottom. So if I'm one of those companies emailing about coronavirus, I would encourage them to sit back and think about the context in where they're communicating. And also, how can I get to the point? How can I make sure my message is getting across quickly so that my customers read it? The last thing you want as a company is to generate complaints because your emails are too long and you don't get to the point. So we come back to the principles. And actually, Julie, you're right. The emails can help preempt queries to customer service if they're clear. So use clear language, get to the point quickly, and keep it short. If your key message is at the top of your email, if you want to then put some more messaging underneath it, people then can choose to read on. But as long as the key points are at the top, that's what's really important in a crisis situation, is get to the point, use clear language, don't hide behind jargon, and keep it really short. Be open and transparent as you can. Tailor obviously for your audiences, but think about the context in which you're landing your messages in. The other key thing, you can't go far wrong, actually, if you think about 5 Ws. So this is what's happening and why, who is affected, where is there a locational point, when is there a timing issue, and how will they find out more. And if you make sure that your messages contain these key points and that everyone in your organisation who's communicating with customers or stakeholders or staff have the same information, they're communicating consistently, then you can't go far wrong with that. Any thoughts on that? The other thing, yeah, FAQs. I'm going to come on to them, but they're really useful tools. The other thing I would recommend, and maybe this is what the government didn't have a chance to do, is to try out what you're going to say. How will your audience respond? What will they think? How will they feel? What might they do as a response to your message? But try and put yourself in their shoes, and make sure that what you're saying in your messaging is what you're actually trying to say. So check for jargon, and that's internal jargon as well as technical or legal jargon. Is there anything that's a bit ambiguous about what you're saying? And how's the tone? Is it consistent with your brand? Does it feel like a message that will come from your organisation? But really trying out your messaging is an important step. So if we come back to social distancing versus stay at home, I think in retrospect, the government would have done that differently. But it's always worth a sense check, and even that's a sense check across a different team that's not in your space that's trying to communicate, then it's worth trying your stuff out on other people. I said I'd come back to frequently asked questions. I've spent many hours writing frequently asked questions, but actually they are worth their weight in gold. You can put them up on the website, you can have them on the intranet for your staff, you can update them as you go along. And also they're a really good way of thinking of what's the most difficult question you could get asked and how would you answer it? Because most of us try to avoid thinking about the hardest questions that you might get asked. But in a crisis situation, you don't want to be sitting there thinking and scratching your head about some of the questions that you think could come up. If you can prepare ahead, do as much as you can. But be warned, they do take longer than you think to finesse and finalise. I'm conscious we're running a little bit out of time here, so you'll be glad to know I'm at the end. So finally, all I would say is when you're in an organisation facing a crisis, it's really easy to focus on operations first. I would urge organisations to include comms teams as early as possible, because they will focus on the emotional and how messaging is going to land in particular. So tag them in early, and also they'll help you to test out what you're trying to say to make sure that it's clear. I'll pass back to Nadim now.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you for taking us through those key points. Hopefully you've found both of the sessions useful. We are running out of time, but in the limited time that we've got, I'd like to go through some of the key pointers. Now, none of this should be rocket science to any of you, and especially if you're managing large teams right now, it is so important that you are taking care of your mental health. I've had a lot of emails from our students and our members as well about how they can handle their mental health during a time of crisis. So this makes me think that there is probably a bit of demand for us to do another whole webinar on this space. So do keep a lookout. In the next few weeks, we will be doing a webinar on how to manage your mental health, and we'll be including our professional counsellor here at LIBF, who will be able to give you some tips that hopefully you can take away and implement in your organizations. But for now, these are my key tips. And again, this sounds pretty simple, but if you do follow it, it really does alleviate that stress. It's so important to plan your day. Every morning that I'm waking up now, I'm actually getting dressed. I am putting on my shirt and my pants instead of sitting in there in my pajamas. I try and move every day, get your exercise. It's really, really important that you take advantage of this, going out and making sure that you walk or run or do whatever's best for you. And if you're suffering from anxiety, and I'm sure a lot of your colleagues are at the moment, is to try as much types of relaxation as possible. I know mindfulness is overrated. A lot of people talk about it all the time, but it's very helpful if you can download any kind of app that you may have which supports you in terms of practicing relaxation. A lot of your organizations will have freebies, for example, perks. I'm sure your HR team or wellbeing team will have offers for you to download videos, for example, maybe try a yoga class, etc. But the one thing I have noticed, and we're doing this really well in our organization, is keeping connected. So webinars such as this is great, but actually using networks within your organization. So for example, in LIBF, we've just recently launched a buddy scheme online, and to break up our day, we are chatting to and meeting up virtually with colleagues that we don't usually work with. So creating sort of a virtual office cooler or a kitchen conversation time. And I find that to be really, really helpful in managing stress. Another thing that you can do is taking time to reflect and practice self-compassion. I think we're a lot, very difficult on ourselves, especially those of you who are parents. I'm not going to mention any names, but the other day I was on a video call with a colleague, and the colleague's child came up to him and hit him on the head with a plastic baseball bat. I think that is the reality, isn't it, of everyone working from home at the moment, and we need to allow ourselves for that to happen. And finally, try and get as much sleep as possible. I went to bed at 9:30 a.m. yesterday, woke up at 5 o'clock, 5:30, and went for a walk in the morning. That has never been my usual pattern before, but we're living in different times. So those are my key tips. If you guys would like, we would be delighted to host another webinar going into much more detail on some of the support that's out there around this topic, and we can get Claire, who's our professional counsellor here, to come in and ask questions. Obviously, we can't go into any personal issues, but we can give you some generic tips. Please do let us know if that would be of interest. Fantastic. Okay. Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. We've kept the time. There are some questions around technical questions around capital adequacy that I mentioned in the banking sector. So what's going to happen if we relax that? I mean, my understanding of that is if that is relaxed too much, that's going to lead to the next economic crisis and crash that's going to happen. And then someone else had a question around accountability. I think that means different things to different people, but it should mean the same thing to both parties. So as long as both people or both groups are on the same page about what it means for each other, then I think that's what accountability means. Okay, everyone, stay safe. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for Liam in the events team for hosting this webinar and for helping us with some of the technical issues in the background. We're really grateful. I hope you all stay connected with the London Institute of Banking and Finance. We'll see you online again soon. Thank you for your time.